and welcome to another KWL live event. We have a live Q&A this time. We're welcoming Jennifer Hilt. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hey, great to be here.
And we are coming live, as always, from Toronto. I like to give a weather update at the beginning. I don't know, it's the Irishness in me, but it's sunny but cold today. How are you feeling, Laura?
Yeah, I was going to say it's still a little chilly over here, but we're getting there.
The tulips are almost blooming. They're not quite, we're not quite in spring yet here in Toronto.
But I keep having flowers pop up and then tilt.
They're just slowly dying again. But do let us know where you're coming in from in the chat. Always nice to see where people are coming from. There's another Tara in the chat. Excellent. Tara's Unite. Love that. And we'll get started today where we're going to be talking all about tropes. So Jennifer, I'm going to do your intro. So Jennifer Hilt is a USA Today best-selling author of the Trope Thesaurus 5-book series. She has written 24 books across 4 pen names, plus her urban fantasy series, The Undead Detective. She works as a plotter and concept creator. With degrees in linguistics and literature, Jennifer loves talking about story development. She also collects dictionaries in unfamiliar languages, binges on Scandi Noir series, and shouts out tropes from the comfort of her couch. That was a wonderful summary, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
So I want us to talk all about the different tropes. I feel like we're going to have a lot to talk about, but let's roll back a little bit first. And I'd like to learn a little bit about you. So how did you go from linguistics to a career as an author?
Yes, it is a kind of a like a winding road. I've always been interested in how things are put together. And it didn't really occur to me that study was linguistics till I got to college. But even when I was little and I was reading stories, I would wonder like how it kind of worked, but I didn't have any much sophisticated skill set to really think about that. So it was really great when I got to college and I discovered linguistics, and there are all these different ways you could think about how things work, particularly language. So I kind of just started to merge those, but I never really got merge the two things until in the pandemic, I was working as a plotter and concept creator, like helping people develop their stories. And I discovered when we were talking about that we needed like common items to talk about. And I was like, oh, well, actually what we're talking about are tropes. And at that time, a lot of tropes was not as, we weren't talking about them even as much as we are now. And people would be like, oh, but I want to write a good story, And I'd be like, yeah, but why, So it kind of got me wondering, but why do we need them? Why can we use them as this common language and yet we're embarrassed or we don't want to be using them? So then I went into this super deep dive where I just started reading like all my favorite books across all these genres, thinking, how is this put together with tropes? And that was kind of the whole thing that made me realize, oh, they're everywhere and in everything. It's just a matter of how you use them. So that was kind of like, and I just decided I was going to like take all of my thoughts on that and just put it in this one book. I had no idea. I worked on it through the pandemic and stuff. And so I had no idea if anybody would even find it interesting, but it was just kind of like, by the time I released that book, there was also more of really the timing was right in terms of like the population, I think because of TikTok was just talking more about tropes. The audience is much more trope savvy. Romance readers have always been that way, but it was like this kind of in general, like I'd see Netflix and BuzzFeed and things talking about what's your favorite, tropes and stuff like that. So it's just kind of a good timing of those two things. But basically the linguistics has been a way for me to talk about literature, which is pretty awesome.
Like, maybe you don't know the answer to this question. Where does the word trope come from? Like, is there an origin that's interesting, or is it like?
That's a good question. I can't think off. I think I've probably looked it up at some point, but I can't think of what like the dictionary, what the dictionary version of it. What I love about it is the superpower is that everybody knows what a trope is when I say it, So like when I say arranged marriage, we all know what that is. I don't have to go and explain some big long thing. And that's kind of like the superpower that we have as authors to use that, because then we can just take the idea and run with it, as opposed to having to go into some like long backstory of setting things up. We have a way to hook our readers immediately.
Nice. Richard has said from Tropes, Latin for a turn.
Awesome.
Don't know the accuracy on that, but I appreciate the research.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I never studied Latin, which I was just thinking about the other day, like, oh, that would be neat to look at.
I was wondering if that was going to be one of your unfamiliar language dictionaries. So Latin is not.
I need to pick up one of those.
For anyone who maybe isn't as savvy with tropes, can you tell us a little bit about what a trope is and how writers use them, and maybe a little bit about how you categorize them?
Sure. So, like I was saying, what I love about tropes is I would say it's kind of flexible in terms of how many there are, because it's like, how do you categorize it? Like the trope secrets, there's so many tropes that can be within it, or it can just be this big category on its own. But that's kind of like one of this kind of superpower things that we can use, is like always give our characters some kind of secret, and we can use that in writing. But a trope is basically, like I was saying, it's a concept that we're all familiar with. The average English reader who's been through middle school is gonna understand that. And so it's helpful because we can use it to kind of set up the framework for our story, and then we can build more complex characters, and we can build plots and things like that. But at least we're starting from a point where we have a recognizable beginning, middle, and end setup. So that's really, I think, why. Because if you look, in fairy tales and going back hundreds of years, tropes are still there. Wicked stepmother, orphan, all these kind of things. So we still see them, and I think the reason why they actually stick around is that they're really talking about relationships. Yes, it's recognizable things, but we're also talking about relationships, and it's like that's the core of all of our stories, and particularly in romance. So I think that's why they've always been so strong in that, and they persist decade after decade, and getting these new reiterations with twisting them. But really just going from that framework of it's something recognizable that people understand and relates to the human condition and that we can use. So those are kind of like the frameworks of things I start out. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I like, with doing all my research and working in this, have really make a distinction between tropes and cliches, because I feel like the great thing about tropes is it's like just a neutral idea. So you can take, something like the idea of a loner, and that can be, you can make that part of a character anything. It can be for an antagonist, or it could be for a protagonist, or it could be a side character. But a cliche is really a fixed idea, and they're almost always negative. So like dumb jock or dumb blonde, like things that are just like, it's hard to make a well-rounded character from that. So I feel like a cliche is a poorly developed trope. So that's why I kind of make a distinction where I don't lump them all together. And it's been really freeing to do that, because then you have so much more material to work with of having all these 40 to 50 other tropes that you can kind of play with. So that's kind of like the kind of basis for how I think about them. And then the question about how to categorize them is interesting, because if you type in tropes on the internet, especially like romance tropes, you're going to get a big alphabetical list. And I was thinking, well, what's a different way I can think about it that's like more user friendly? So that I try to think about them in different ways. Like, are these, you can separate tropes in for your story of, do you want them to be like the main theme going through it, or do you want them to be like the secondary themes, or maybe with side characters? So that's primary, secondary is one way. Another way is if they're like person, place, or object, and like tropes in those ways. Like, do you want tropes to help describe the person? Do you want something that helps with like your location? Or do you want something that's like an object, like MacGuffin, if you're doing like a romantic suspense and they're trying to like find the antidote or something like that? And then the third way is, again, talking about, are they secrets or changes? And those are like other things that can be an impetus for action in your story. So those are kind of like three ways in my first book that I just kind of tried to break them down in different ways. So if you're like working on a story and you're stuck, you can kind of think, oh, can I find a trope that falls into one of these categories to help me, as opposed to like scrolling through these lists.
No, I thought that was really helpful. I love that distinction between like the trope and the cliche there. I think that's good, because you're reading my questions ahead of time was one that I was going to ask about. But I also like I like how you broke it down to like how the story could have like the primary or secondary trope, or even like the person, place, and object. I guess I hadn't really considered like place as a trope, but it totally is. Like it could be like a misty moor, for instance, and you sort of know what you're getting into while you're there.
Yes, and I totally think, especially in romance, I think of, forced proximity is such almost like a place trope, right? Because we have to have everybody kind of like a way to force them to interact when they want to run away, you know? So, so you can even think of it like that, but it's like almost, you know, I think it's like in all romances to some extent, but yeah, it's just like try to help people think about it in a different way, because I feel like we tend to think of tropes really fixed, and they're almost more like when you take out like new Play-Doh or new clay, and you have to start to like work with it with your hands to make it bendable and do the things you want it to do. And I think that's really what we can do with tropes.
I got so excited when you brought up forced proximity, because that's one of my favorite tropes in romance novels. And that's the first thing I thought of when you said place, because yeah, I love that, like, oh, they're snowed in at a cabin and they're stuck there kind of thing. So
and that's why it works. And the other thing that I've been kind of thinking about lately is like some tropes work well with other tropes, like kind of almost play well. And one of them is the ticking time bomb. So like, even if you're writing something that's like not romantic suspense, I still think that the ticking time bomb trope we can think of as anything that's got like an element of time, of like an expiration date. So being pregnant, a wedding, you know, trying to get a job, interviews, you know, different kind of things. So if you kind of think about it in that way with forced proximity, you can get a lot of story juice for your story in that way by like combining those two together.
Nice. And a question here from Richard. What's the most well-known example, or I guess maybe your favorite example of a forced proximity trope?
Well, it's not romance, but I love forced proximity. I love sci-fi when it's like they're stuck on a ship. So like it's an older example, but I still love it. Farscape. It was this Australian sci-fi series where they're like marooned on this ship and they all have to like survive. So, but really it's kind of but in romance, like I said, often it'll be like a place of like you said, the snowed in cabin, or you know, a wedding, or they work in the same office, or it can be any kind of setting where they can't like just run away, you know, or escape.
Yeah. I guess like Lost. So Vanessa, who is producing this, is a big Lost fan. So I'm just shouting that out for her.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Lost. My favorite example of forced proximity probably, and again, this isn't romance, but did you guys ever see the TV show Severance?
No.
The Apple, it was like just really great. But anyway, it was placed in in an office building, and it's all about an unusual twist of the amnesia trope, which is why I am like a complete and utter fan of it. But but it had but they used the forced proximity in a cool way in that too. But you know, you just kind of, I think, look for whatever story you're reading or watching, look for it, because you will find it when you start looking for it. That's the kind of neat thing. It's like a hunt.
Nice. The third thing that you mentioned in sort of like in your book, the Trope Thesaurus, which we'll link to in the chat, you mentioned the kind of, so we have the primary and secondary areas. There's the person, place, object, and then either like a secret base or a change base. So can you like elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I thought that was really interesting as well as a consideration for writing tropes.
Yeah. So the thing I like about secret and change is I think that they can really, you know, be used in any genre. And secrets is like just a giant, you know, a giant category, but within it, there's some ones that we know more of, like hidden identity, or sometimes mistaken identity, or my favorite, secret baby, because I love that in mysteries, as I talk about, or like fake relationship. Those can be kind of secrets. And then the change-based ones I think of is really more like the ugly duckling trope. I think of as, you know, it's very common in most of our stories that we have the characters go through a major change. But the ugly duckling is like kind of, if that's the focus of the story, the character going on that transformation journey, then I kind of think it can be kind of clumped under the ugly duckling. So those are just like some kind of ways that you can think about them. Like if you're like in my story, like I don't have enough action with the character, like I don't have them really making this internal change. You can like think of like the ugly duckling as if like the loner who has to learn to trust and, you know, open his heart to the heroine, or things like that. That can be like a transformation of the ugly duckling trope. So just kind of thinking of different ways that you can embed embed them or like work together is kind of, I think, the best way to think about them.
It almost kind of gives you like a jump start too, if you're thinking about like getting writer's block or something.
Right.
It can give you kind of a way to create a conflict in the story to keep it going. So that's interesting as well.
Like one thing I was thinking about with the Ugly Duckling is like with the Barbie movie, it's like the idea that that's basically like one big ugly duckling trope, because but it's like a great twist because, like, of course, obviously she's this gorgeous woman, but she's going through this transformation of wanting to be, a real girl, kind of like the Pinocchio thing. And so it's like, oh, that was like realizing that was what that movie was. It's like, well, to do that. So it's like the more you like start to look for them, the more you can see them. And I think that's really the kind of fun part about it.
Is existential crisis a trope?
Well, I think, I think you could fit it into any of these, like these
Right.
secrets you change that we're talking about. So yeah, exactly. And the kind of neat thing about it is like, if I think about that, it makes me more stressed, like, existential choices. But I think about, oh, Ugly Duckling, it seems more manageable, of like how I could work with that with my character. It's like, make it more, I think I was thinking recently that tropes really help with the show don't tell, because they give you things that you can use for like building scenes and plots and stuff. And when people tell you that.
In the Trope Thesaurus, you also mention the goal, motivation, conflict principle.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about this and how writers use it in conjunction with tropes?
Oh, yeah. I love talking about goal, motivation, conflict. And I feel like whenever I start to talk about it, everybody kind of like groans inwardly, because and before I kind of started to pair them with tropes, I couldn't really get a handle on how to use it in my writing. But then when I was starting to use tropes, I'm like, okay, we have this basic idea and we want to make it our own, and trying to think of how to do that. And then I was like, oh, what if we pair it with goal, motivation, and conflict? So what I like about goal, motivation, and conflict is it's really all about the conflict. And what we're trying to do is create what is going to be the most stressful, life-changing event for our characters. And the way to do that is by giving them a goal and then having them try to reach it and throwing all these things in their way. And when I was working on that idea and working with other writers, it occurred to me that, it's not like, what are some ways we can make that break it down to make it more tangible? So one thing that I find is I think a goal has to be, I talk about it being meaningful and measurable. And so you want your character, and this is us as authors knowing about our characters. The characters themselves might not know that. They may think, oh no, I'm totally fine and happy as this warrior loner guy. I don't need to have a relationship with this girl. But we as authors know they are perfect for each other. We just have to have them realize it. So I like to have the goals be meaningful and measurable. So like, yes, it's a thing that's going to change their life. And then the measurable part is, there needs to be a way for plotting to know whether they achieve it or not. So that's why we see so many stories of like, oh, they're taking over like the failing bed and breakfast, or they're trying to get this promotion, or they're trying to, raise enough money for something, or find, like I said, the anecdote. It's like having like a concrete thing that at the end of that the characters can work to. And at the end of the story, we can be like, oh yeah, they either reached their goal or they didn't. Really, really helps with plotting. And I think this is especially true in romance, because when I work with romance authors, a lot of time they're like, oh, but the goal is like for them to be in love. But it's super hard to plot a story where, that's what you're trying to plot, is scenes of them being in love. You can plot them trying to achieve something, and then within that, you can set up all these scenes of their emotional journey growing. So that's why I think goal is so important. And motivation is like that idea of what's the impetus behind that? What is like kind of the theme of your story? And then conflict is, of course, how it's going to be difficult to get it. And you want the conflict and the goal to be as much in opposition of each other as possible to give you great story juice. So an example about that, I don't know, what is there a movie you guys have watched recently or something that you want me to use? And it's like something as an example.
I feel like Laura, you're like got the romance examples on the
I
top
was,
brain.
when you were talking about kind of like the goal, I was thinking of a romance series, which is Cressley Cole's Immortals After Dark series.
Oh,
And
okay. Yep.
one of the books is them kind of doing like this giant race
Oh,
against
yeah.
all these mystical creatures, and they're all trying to find this magical item,
Yep.
and they
Yep.
all have a different reason for using it. So
Mhm.
that's one of the things that I thought of when
Oh,
it's
yeah.
actually like a clear goal that gives you
Right.
a theme, because it brings all these different like creatures
Mhm.
together, and then there's of course conflict as they kind of battle each other to try and
Of
get
course.
it.
Yeah.
But really, like, they're conflicting because it's two of them who end up together, but they both have reasons to want the item. So there's
Mhm.
definitely a lot of
Yeah.
conflict throughout.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think with the two, if you're, just writing, if you're not doing like, if you're just writing with two main characters, that you really want them to, that the goal should be something they both want, or they want to make sure the other one doesn't get it. Like the tying those two things together is what really gives you great story conflict. So it's like important to think about that as you're working on your plot and stuff. Like, so yeah, I haven't read that series, but that sounds exactly like what they did. And in a way, it's kind of like simple, right? Because it's like, complex characters, simple plot. It's like they need to get this thing. Like that's the plot of the story you just talked about. And um, all the great intrigue comes from the characters and the world building of like the things they have to go through to get that thing.
I like that you talk about like the world building and like adding depth to the books by like adding this sort of like goal, motivation, conflict for even like the little like the sub characters, and like not necessarily like obviously your protagonist should have it, but
Right.
really like building out the, I guess,
The cast.
how much detail you have with the kind of world and the characters there.
Yes.
So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if you guys are familiar with Lucy Score, but I think she does a great job with that with her books. Like they're just, and it's really helpful if you're writing a romance series, because then your readers are getting hooked as you go. Like I really love Anna Wang's King series. Like she has this, and the fourth book is coming out like next week, but she's been teasing these two characters all along, and I'm like, of course I pre-ordered it, and I'm like, okay, I'm like, it's coming out April 30th, and I'm totally ready to read it. And but it's just kind of great because and she did that by making sure not only did she have each of the couple main characters in the stories very well, but she did enough work with the side characters that you're like, oh, I want to, when's their story coming? I want their story. So, and it really is more believable too, because everybody in our lives, you just kind of think about our daily lives, everybody around us has their own stories. So it's that same kind of idea. But it's especially helpful, I think, with writing series when you can set up these little nuggets for readers.
And I'm curious about what's your favorite trope to read or enjoy, and does that differ to your favorite trope that you like to write?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I love amnesia just because I think there's so many other things you can do with it besides how it normally gets used. And I talk a lot about that in my horror trope thesaurus book. But I would say that's the one that I think about the most, of like, okay, or I'm always looking for other ways that it gets used besides, as I call it, the bonk on the head, where somebody, loses their memory and then they like regain it at some other convenient time. And then I think for myself, for when I'm working on stories, I love like hidden identity. Where some like I like a lot of mystery stuff, and so it's like, oh, and that is like again embedded in secrets of, you thought that was this person was, but it's really this whole other thing going on. So those, and I think there's so much life to those tropes that you can just use them in so many different ways. But those are just kind of some of my favorites. I think the more I like study this stuff, the more I really see that the power with tropes is not to just like, oh, I'm going to use this one trope through my story. It's like using lots of tropes in different ways and combining them. And those are like when I like think about stories that I love that I'm reading, I'm like, oh, actually they used, these tropes for this person and these tropes for that person. And then they threw some like, plot tropes in there too. So, and just seeing how they do that is really the kind of neat part about it. But for me, I'm always just like curious. Like we were talking before this started about John Wick, of which I'm a huge fan of. Not romance, but I love it. And one of the reasons I love it is the world building. I mean, that world was so cool. Like, who is this guy? Who is that hotel? I mean, all the kind of rules they had.
And the motivation was so pure. Like, you just can't kill his dog.
That inciting incident with the dog,
right.
Everyone can relate to that moment.
Yes.
Like,
yeah. And the other thing I think that makes that such a strong movie is the relationship between John Wick and the villain, whose name I forget. Was it Victor? I'm not sure. Anyway,
just Mr. Bad Guy. It's fine.
The Russian man who he used to work for. So I mean, like they had this relationship, and then so it's like I love it when the protagonist and the antagonist, like that relationship is just like super tight, and I think that's what made that such a great part of that, such a great movie, is they each knew each other. And so they knew their strengths and their weaknesses, and that it wasn't just like, yes, it was ridiculously violent, but it had so much great stuff to back it up. And so that's kind of like, I love it when stories put a lot of work into the antagonist, because I really feel like that can just drive so much of the story, is pushing the protagonist to be, their best by going up against somebody who knows all their weaknesses and is, really, it has nothing to lose. So yeah, I definitely want to see that new Monkey King movie, because it seems very similar.
Now, in contrast, do you have a trope that you avoid reading and watching, like can't do it?
Let me think about that. That's a good question. Mostly what I like it if tropes are not too obvious. So it's more like a question of development than like, oh, I don't like that one. I'm just trying to think about that one. If there's, I guess, this is kind of a good example. I think that it's kind of hard to do arranged marriage tropes in contemporary romance these days. And then that series I was talking about with Anna Wang, the first one in that is a arranged marriage. And I can't remember the name of it, but it's the first one in her King series. And it made me like so happy, because she took this trope that I feel like doesn't really get used in a really powerful way, and she tied it to this young woman's culture. And it completely made sense as a character, even though she's, in this, modern woman and things like that. And I was like, oh, so that made me like really like feel like, oh yeah, there's just still ways you can keep using, tropes after, even after all this time. I was thinking of Mail Order Bride. That's one that I'm not a huge fan of. And I think it would be interesting to do, to try to like maybe try to do one with like science fiction or something like that, romance, to do some other twists on it. But that's kind of like, in general, that's not one that I see used a whole lot. Or that I'm like, oh, I want to read that if yeah. I guess if you could do a Mail Order Bride one and twist it up with like, sci-fi and like, amnesia and hidden identity and things like that, you could probably come up with something pretty cool. But
I like you talk a little bit about in your book, you mention a lot like the secret baby trope. And I was chatting with Vanessa, who's running this, yesterday about it. And we were talking about how it's like it says baby, which is like, it's actually really the hidden identity trope that you've just sort of mentioned. Like, so what would be the main differentiator between those two? Because like we all were a baby once, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a pregnancy in your storyline or anything. It just means that like somebody is revealed, Luke, I am your father,
Right. Yes. No, I think it really is a hidden identity trope, like you say. I guess what I think about it is the secret baby is because, especially I think like it gets, used a lot in mystery or thriller. And so we never see the baby part. It's always the, oh, guess what? So-and-so had a baby and it was raised by somebody else. And that's how that person's out for revenge or something like that. But it has this whole other backstory that you didn't know that provides fantastic motivation. It was kind of like and really good stories will have it like simmering, like there'll be like these little clues in the beginning that you'll see at the very end at the reveal, like, oh, but I mistook that for something else. So that's another trope, red herring. But I guess I think they're the same, they're kind of the same thing, but it's just kind of how you're using it. I think secret baby tends to be used, in romance as like just to focus on the baby, that there was a couple got together, she got pregnant, he doesn't know she's pregnant, then they get together again. And so that's how you generally see it in romance. And then but the like result of it is more how it gets used in mystery thriller. So I wouldn't say that they're really that different. It's just kind of how if you're using, like you say, the baby, or you're using the identity part. But I think that's kind of the neat part about tropes, is that you can do them, like fiddle with them in different ways like that. And it doesn't have to be so fixed. But I feel like the kind of downside of recognizing that is almost all mysteries now, when I read them, I'm like, there's going to be a secret baby in this. There's going to be a hidden, it's like, and then it's kind of funny how often it happens. So it's like to try not to look for it, so you're still surprised in the end,
Yeah, I like that you kind of, in your Trope Thesaurus, and then I also went through the romance one, but you kind of break down like a very general, like, theme of like the genre. So mystery is all about the puzzle piece. That thriller, it's like it's the push and pull between like your main character and the villain, and then like suspense is all about the tension. And then when we talk about romance, it seems to be all about the happy ever after. And I was really surprised that you kind of called out, like, say, Titanic, in that like Titanic is not a romance, it's a love story. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about like the differentiation between this here? Like, does a romance have to have, like, by definition, a happily ever after?
I would say so, because that's what romance readers have been, kind of trained us as authors. Because if you call something a romance and you write a story and, one of them dies in a car crash at the end, even though they've had this great love affair, and she goes on to like marry, his best friend, and you call that a romance, I can't even imagine the amount of hate mail that's going to be flooded, your way. And so it's like the kind of definition of a romance is, happily ever after is like an emotionally satisfying ending, that these characters are going to go through all kinds of horrible things. And then the result of that is like some security, some safety, some like, optimism. And a love story, though, doesn't necessarily, a love story can be, this very passionate affair, but it doesn't have to end in, the same way. So I think that that is an important distinction, because true romance readers know that. Now, I know there's been like a lot of shift in that marketplace with some new authors lately. I'm trying to think of, I can't think of her name right now. The one, she has some stories about like domestic violence that have been really popular. I can't think of her name right now, but you guys probably know.
Colleen Hoover?
Yes, Colleen Hoover. Yeah. So I think that there's like been shifts with that, and I think that's a lot of it is with TikTok, which is really interesting. It's like a whole other interesting thing to think about, of how that like changes the marketplace. But in general, I would never advise somebody to call something a romance and not have it end in a way that is optimistic. Because I just think I understand Colleen Hoover's like, doing her own thing, and she's obviously doing it very successfully. But in general, I think that's like taking on a lot to like try to change a genre like that.
A comment from a different Colleen, but relevant. Just got a review in the first novella that wasn't hot enough, even though it was categorized as a sweet, clean romance.
Oh, I'm so glad she was saying this, because I was thinking about that, and then I got distracted by the Titanic thought. So one thing we haven't talked about, but is super important, is genre expectations, and that's really like, I think almost like if you're going to form like a triad of like tropes and goal, motivation, and conflict, then the third kind of point of that would be genre expectations. And I am really sorry for Colleen, because that's like very stressful and frustrating for somebody to do that, because if you've written a sweet, clean romance, the hot enough part is like, yeah, it's the definition of a sweet, clean romance would be close the door. You wouldn't be going into any kind of detail. Kind of like Julia Roberts' stories, like she talked about how she's like, oh, the door closes and she wakes up the next morning and they're having breakfast, that kind of thing. So that is kind of, somehow there was like a marketing miscue with why, or maybe the reader just didn't care and they're like, I'm going to read this book anyway, even though it's, says it's sweet and clean. And it's hard because then you got to deal with the fallout of that. But in general, yeah, you really do need to know, like, what do the covers look like in my genre, and that your cover that looks like them. I know that's like always so crushing to hear when you're like, I have this great idea, I'm going to have this other kind of covers, like, but really readers are wanting, if I like this story, then I'll like that story. So you really want to have a sense of like, do my covers look like the other covers in this genre, so that I'm not confusing readers. And so, yeah, so like for the whole thing of hot or spicy is another word for it. It's really interesting because there's really a continuum with that. And I wish that there was like a grading, like for hot sauce, because like a lot of writers will say, oh, I write really hot, and I'll read their book and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I mean, it's got some spice to it, but it's not like, oh, it's like blow my socks off. And then there's like, so that is like, I think trickier for other writers when you are not in the sweet, clean area, because then you're trying to like find out who writes similar heat levels to me, and how can we kind of like tap in to communicate that to the readers. But yeah, that's really frustrating. And I think it's just, the thing with reviews also is that you just got to keep writing and keep doing your work, and it's only one person's opinion. And I feel like for like every one person who leaves a negative review, there's like 10 or 20 other people who loved it, but they just didn't take the time to do it. So if you get a lot of people like misunderstanding the way the book was marketed, then it's like, okay, let me go back and look at the cover, go back and look at the blurb, and those kind of things. But yeah, that's just really frustrating, especially if when you get a review and somebody's like, I don't usually read this genre, I don't like whatever, and then they like leave a it's like, well, then don't read it and don't leave a review. I mean, that's like ridiculous,
I also find it kind of confusing now with romance, because a lot of them have the cartoon covers, and sometimes those are steamy, like super steamy, and sometimes they're clean. And I've had the opposite experience when I thought it was going to be steamy and it was not. So it's a bit confusing.
Yeah, and that is really interesting with those illustrated covers, right? Because I agree, they all look so similar when I see them, that I'm like, oh, that's YA, no, that's not YA, or something, so yeah. And I think it's just, I'm thinking part of what's driving the illustrated covers, or at least initially, was probably things with Facebook and marketing things, because they were all against like the man chest, and you can't show this and you can't show that and all this kind of stuff. So like using illustrated covers was probably a way to get around it, but then that creates other like challenges of trying to market it.
Guys, I just had a great idea. Like the hot sauce videos, hot ones, but somehow we do it with romance.
Yes,
like we get people that they just read progressively hotter scenes.
That would be great.
All right, nobody steal that idea. That is my idea.
and you should have like the hot sauce, and then the hot sauce, rating.
Yeah, like some sort of rating.
Right.
We're gonna trademark it, and we're gonna do a follow-up live where we read out different scenes.
Oh gosh.
And we could do it while doing hot sauce chicken wings, because
why not merge all of the worlds, more tropes, more things together?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Tara had a comment here saying that yes, she liked that the all romance are love stories, but all love stories aren't romance. Laura, I'm curious about your opinion on this.
Yeah, I agree, because I agree with what Jennifer was saying earlier about how it needs a happy ending. If there's not a happy ending, then I don't think it's a romance story, because I don't go into a romance expecting a sad ending, and I'd be disappointed if they didn't end up together at the end or something like that.
All right.
Yeah, you
Point
you can
proven.
write those stories. Like I tell people, it's not that you can't write those stories, but just don't call it a romance. It's
Yeah.
fiction. It's, whatever that like genre is with that. Like women's fiction, right? That's not romance if it's like about a woman's journey, and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's also another point that comes back to marketing, because if you don't market that correctly and people go into it expecting a happy ending and to get that experience, then again, it's going to show in the reviews.
Right. Right. Yep.
Speaking of that, have you ever had an experience where you're reading a book and you're like, this is too many tropes at once? The author is trying to do too many things.
Honestly, I have the opposite experience. I feel like, I feel like I mentioned like Lucy Scorgan. I feel like she uses every possible trope and she does like a fantastic job. And her books are just so like, they're just so well-rounded and real, because she's just packed so many different elements in them. But I sometimes read books that I feel are too flat, like there isn't enough development. And I'm like, oh, we could have turned this character into somebody that's got a lot more stuff going on, but that's a personal preference thing. And it also depends like on your genre expectations. So like, for example, like personally, the Twilight series and the 50 Shades of Grey, which, I mean, of course, we all know how incredibly popular these stories are. I've found both of those heroines in those stories like really kind of flat. Like I wish they had like more interesting parts to them, but it certainly didn't prevent them from being incredibly popular and that people really enjoying them. But, it would have been great if there was like some more aspects of like, I would have liked it if like the women had like a little bit more of like a dark side, or they weren't always so just like sweet about everything, but so for me, I usually wish there was kind of more tropes in something as opposed to too many. But that's kind of just, I think, also goes into what your genre expectations are of liking things.
With the 50 Shades example, that kind of jumped out at me, and you're reading the trope, I keep saying trope, the Trope Thesaurus, like merging them together. That like with like say like erotica or more kind of like active romance stuff, the goal really is just like them, like the physical act. Do you think that kind of goes into perhaps why the characters sometimes aren't as explored, because the goal isn't really anything else, or should there be more?
Well, I think for erotic romance, I mean, the emotional goal was still like to be in a committed, fulfilled relationship, right? Like that was, but I think, honestly, what made both those both Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey so popular was their use of world building. So like the vampires, obviously, and then the other one was like the whole BDSM thing. I mean, that was completely off like the general radar until that came out, and I think so she just took like basic story ideas. I mean, like both of those stories to me seem like very like basic versions of Jane Eyre. So it was kind of like the general story idea that's been popular throughout centuries, and then just like, updated the characters in different ways, quite successfully, obviously, and tapping into interests in the market. And I also feel like the Fourth Wing that's really popular now with the dragons is also kind of like another iteration of that kind of story. So I think it just kind of depends, what you're looking at. But I think when we do all this talking about tropes, it is still important to realize that your world building is really like the secret sauce that brings the story into what makes your story unique from everybody else's, and what can really hook readers into it, the 50 Shades of Grey lady was like super smart to realize, oh, this is like a whole untapped area that I could explore in this very popular general storyline. And, I think also Rebecca Yarros with her Fourth Wing, like the flying dragons, super cool, so I don't know, that I guess I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that kind of just was what got me thinking about with the genre expectations and how that kind of ties in.
We talked about TikTok a little bit before. Are you seeing a lot of authors write based on popular tropes that are basically what people are loving on TikTok or talking about from TikTok?
I think the way of advertising a book where you have the tropes called out on the cover is super popular now, and for a reason, because those are tropes that people are familiar with or that are popular right now. I think I think that there's tropes that are evergreen, like forbidden love and unrequited love, and things that we're going to see again and again, because those are just really common to the human condition, and so that's why they worked 200 or 300 years ago, and they're going to work now. I think the kind of writing to market of following things that are popular on TikTok, to do that, you have to be somebody who can write fast and like get them out. And I'm not personally a fast writer. So if I tried to do that, like by the time I had stuff come out in a year, it would probably no longer be popular. So you have to kind of like be aware of like your own capabilities of being able to, capitalize on trends like, reverse harem. When it first came out, there was not nearly enough of it. And so, a lot of people were able to pivot to that and really have great success. And now there's like quite a bit of it. So, it's not as like easy to get seen with those stories. So it's always really hard to kind of figure out if you can kind of hop onto a trend or just kind of fold elements of those into your stories.
Colleen has a good comment here as well, saying that she's seen some trope reveal graphics in ARC Facebook groups that really let the readers know what's included. That seems like a very specific romance thing, right? Like, yeah.
It totally is. I love that.
You're like, tell me exactly what I'm going to be reading.
Authors doing that on Twitter or Facebook really sell the book to me. I'm like, yes, add to cart.
Yeah, but I'm seeing it in I just read The Housemaid, which is a super popular thriller, and her blurbs actually lists, like in the title of it'll say twisty, like she actually uses tropes in her book descriptions, which is really interesting in the title. So I was like, oh, so it's like migrating, because it used to just be kind of romance that will do that, and now we're seeing it in other areas too. So yeah, I think because, like I said, it's like the audience is so much more savvy about tropes that we're probably just going to keep continuing to see them. I mean, 5 years ago, you would have never like done that at all, and it's just kind of like, oh, that's so interesting. That totally works.
Tara's asking, do you have a recommended resource for world building for romance? Well, firstly, I would say the Trope Thesaurus, romance specifically, but both of them. But is there anything else that kind of comes to mind?
World building for romance. I'm trying to think. I don't off the top of my head. If I think of something after, I'll let you guys know, and you can probably stick it in the show notes. I guess for me, the world building is pretty personal. Like I kind of generally think about, okay, well, I'm gonna like action, dialogue, and thought are like the three things that I think of with and of course you have description. So I like think of those things as elements of world building, and then I just think of how am I going to use that in this story. But as in terms of like a specific world building guide, nothing is coming to me at this exact moment. I think,
except for your book. I think it is honestly like going through the amount of different tropes and the examples. I think you would start to see them everywhere, and it might help, especially breaking down like the primary and the place and all of those steps. So I recommend that for sure.
Well, thank you. The other thing I think is to really think about like what is your inspiration for it, and like what do you want, like what do you want to see that you're not seeing in the marketplace, or using those kind of things. Also with world building is I think really important, because it's really like it's in a way almost like the most personal part, I feel like, of the story, because it's like where your voice comes through and things like that. So yeah, it's such an all, and when I talk about it, I talk about it as like the last thing, because I feel like in a way it's the thing that you got to like loop around and put everything in, encompass everything in. But it's like helpful if you have the idea of like what the tropes are and goal, motivation, and conflict, and what's kind of happening with some of the relationships, and then the world building is almost like the glue that holds everything all together.
Silence.
Sorry,
No,
I
that was
froze for a sec. Can we talk a little bit about the difference between some of these tropes? Because one example that kind of seems similar maybe to me as a reader is alpha hole and bad boy. What would you say the difference is between those ones?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good example. I tend to think
I had never heard the phrase alpha hole either prior to reading your book, so I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, there's other like word, like it's hard because there'll be other words that mean the same thing, like the grump is also kind of one in there. I guess I think of the alpha hole, I tend to think of as like the very successful like billionaire type business guy, or a like military kind of guy. And then the bad boy, I tend to think of as somebody who's
Maybe like more of a mafia person.
yeah, mafia person, or yeah, just like, yeah, mafia, or some kind of I guess I was thinking of like the motorcycle books kind of idea, but that again kind of falls into mafia. I think it's kind of, it sounds like this like kind of big manifesto, but when I sometimes when I think about tropes, it almost always really comes down to what the power structure is. And I was like, the alpha hole, I feel like that guy's got all the power. So if we like go back to like Mr. Rochester and the 50 Shades of Grey guy and the Twilight guy, those are big alpha guys, right? And there's something about that that's very appealing to romance writers, or it wouldn't persist for all this time, like the material and possession, and that like this very powerful person only has eyes for this, kind of unassuming heroine. And where the bad boy is kind of more, I guess, something that is like, depending on what your view of him or your shade of him is, where like, I feel like everybody agrees the alpha hole is a jerk. And only she can see like the side of him that's better. Where the bad boy, I guess I think of as like, he's deep down, he's a really good guy, but he might be like undercover, like we say with the mafia or things like that. But I tend to think of the bad boys as more like physical, I guess. But I think honestly, like if you know what you're doing, what you're doing with your character, you can label it, I wouldn't worry too much about, oh, is he a bad boy or alpha hole, like while you're working on it, and then you can like later you can kind of, oh, he's a this kind of guy, to figure it out. But
yeah, I guess it's about like the like redemption piece. Like it doesn't seem like the alpha hole can be redeemed, or like maybe we want him to, but the bad boy, like that could maybe be the motivation as well as that, like,
No, and that's a really good point about redemption, because I think that's really huge in romance. And it can be like the bad boy is like others' perception of him really is like matters to that person, where I don't think the alpha hole really cares, or they're fine with being the alpha hole, and so there's kind of that element of it, of like what's the perception of, and then and definitely the redemption trope would play into that. Yeah, that's so interesting to think about. What a good point that you guys raised. I had like,
no, it's good. So you must have like such a keen eye for seeing tropes like everywhere now. I mean, we've talked about like books and TV and movies and things. Has the amount of tropes, or like, has this work ever stopped you from enjoying something because it takes you out of the experience?
Right. Actually, no, because when I see something that's like really well done, like when I'm really absorbed in something, I'm not doing this, pulling it out. And so then, and only when it's done, I'll be like, oh, there are all these tropes, like these, like I'll know there's stuff in it, but I'm like all caught up in the story. Or like a really good book, I'll just read it for the enjoyment, and then I can go back through and like, oh, how did they, use tropes to do that? But it's like fun for me, like to like, oh, how, because it's like endless the ways that you can combine the things. Some things I don't like if it's too like heavy-handed, then I'm be like, so for what was an example of, so my family's really big in Star Wars, and I watched like 2 minutes of The Mandalorian, and I was like, no. And they really enjoyed it, and they were as they were talking about it, I could hear all these tropes, but when I started to watch it, it was just going to be like kind of painful, because it just felt like I wanted them to be, kind of more developed than, and it was clearly very successful. So, I would have been a horrible showrunner for that, obviously, but, sometimes it just depends on what it is and how it's portrayed. Like when we talk about John Wick, that thing is of course packed with tropes. But I've seen it multiple times, and it doesn't stop me from enjoying it because of how it's done, So it just kind of depends, but it's really fun when you can see tropes in different things, because then you see how different things were like put together in ways you hadn't thought of. Like, I'm just working on a piece for Substack now where I talk about the TV show Resident Alien that's on Netflix, and it's basically, like, if you're old enough to remember, like Northern Exposure, it's a doctor who goes in this rural community, but he's an alien, and it's like it uses lots of tropes, and the characters are really fun, and a twist on it. But what I really enjoy in that show is a twist on the opposites attract trope, because it's the doctor whose hidden identity is the alien is, and the one person who can actually see he's an alien is a boy in town. And so the kind of push-pull of this relationship, the boy's always trying to expose him, the doctor's always trying to kill him, but it's like in a comedic way, like he's horrible, he keeps messing up. And it's like, when I was watching it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that I was like, this relationship is like really interesting to me. It's like the reason why I keep watching this show. What is it? And I was like, it's opposites attract. Like they can't not interact with each other. They need each other, but yet they kind of hate each other. So it's fun when you realize, somebody put a twist on something that you hadn't seen before.
Thanks. I love that. And then kind of on the flip of things, like has a trope stopped you enjoying anything, but has going through all of these tropes, has it influenced or improved your fiction writing, do you think?
I hope so. I'm working on a thriller now, and I'm very thoughtful about that, I still try to kind of go with my idea, and then I'll think about it later. I'm like, that's actually the X trope, or hidden identity or mistaken identity or something. And so it's still kind of like for a balance of inspiration and then how you develop it. And I feel like it's like a seesaw, and always trying to get it to that balance point. But I'm hoping so.
So in addition to the Trope Thesaurus and Trope Thesaurus for romance, you've also written about horror tropes, and you've used Kickstarter to fund like your fantasy and sci-fi. What do you have coming up next?
I'm working on the mystery thriller one, which I'm going to do a Kickstarter for this fall. And I'm really excited about that, because now I get to watch all these and read all these, mysteries and thrillers. So it's really fun to kind of get to and think about what are the different subgenres, and things like that. So it's just kind of fun to just work in these different things. And Tara and I had talked about how I want to do a memoir one down the road, because there's so many tropes that are in memoir. It's like another form of storytelling. So it's kind of neat to also dip into reading those and think about how that works too. So I really feel lucky that I've been able to look at different genres and really think about how stories put together. I really feel like I'm pretty lucky to be able to do that.
It must be so fun. You're like, I'm researching. You're just watching John Wick again.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Very true. Yeah.
I didn't expect that we'd be talking about John Wick so much today, but I love it. And
now I want to watch it again.
Me too. And I hope it encourages everyone listening to watch it if they haven't already.
I know. It's so good. It's like the world, yeah. And for the person who asked about world building, if you know, yeah, I think it's a great example of that.
Well, if there is any kind of additional questions, we'll see them on afterwards. Thanks so much, everyone, for the interaction throughout. I think there's some books being written in the comments here about alpha holes.
Oh, good.
So
Yeah.
that's great to
It's
see.
very popular. Yes, I always like a good alpha hole. And there's like, there's authors who like they write those kind of characters and readers love them, so it's like if you tap into that, then you really can, into certain tropes, you can really find the strong fan base.
Nice. And so if people wanted to learn more about you, where on the internet can they find you?
You can visit my website at jenniferhilt.com, and you can also friend me on Facebook. That's usually where I hang out, and I'm over on Substack too.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. This
Oh,
has been
yeah.
so fun. I feel like we could keep talking.
Yeah, we definitely could.
Yeah, it's been really fun for me too. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'd love to have you on again. Maybe we can talk specific like horror tropes toward the end of
That'd
the
be
year. Or something.
awesome. I love horror stuff. So yes, absolutely. Hit me up.
Nice. And once we trademark our spice,
yes,
whatever we're going to do there,
our new
we'll get you involved.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Nice. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you again next month. And yeah, have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Take care.